The movie begins with Mr. Snow in an enclosed meeting with a man called Mr. Straker, who tasks him to retrieve a crucial item for him. Mr. Straker told Snow to take his truck to the wharf at 6 o'clock in the evening to receive a large crate for him. He further emphasized how important the crate is, then told him to deliver it to the Marston house, which is his new home. Mr. Snow and his friend Hank arrived at the house they were supposed to do the drop-off. Hank got down first to open the cellar while Snow backed the truck up. They jointly lifted the crate and carried it into the cellar, as it was the instructions of Mr. Straker. The cellar was too dark and the crate was too heavy, so Hank stumbled on a plank which made him drop the crate and it broke. Snow immediately turned the lights on and they discovered the crate was packed with dirt, but they ignored it and continued moving the crate. They finally dropped off the crate and was about to leave, but Snow started hearing a voice that was calling out to him to come closer, but Hank talked him out of it and they both left. Ben Mears was sightseeing from a distance at the Marston house, then a police officer startled him and asked what he was doing there, and he told him that he used to live here before, so the police left him. Ben left there almost immediately and went to a real estate company to look for a place to rent, and that was when he met Susan, who was reading his book, and she developed a liking towards him. He made inquiries about the Marston house because he saw someone there while he was sightseeing, then she told him that it's an European fella that bought the house of recent, and his shop is just right across the street. Ben was introduced to his new home by an aged lady, told him everything he needed to know about the place. Ralph, Mark and Petrie were trying to do a magic trick, but then Richie Bodden, who happens to be a bully, walked towards them. Richie punched Petrie so hard in the face that he fell, but Petrie wasn't ready to let that slide. He pinned Richie to the ground and wouldn't let him go till Mr. Burke separated them, and after giving him a word of advice, they all dispersed. The children were on their way home, but Mr. Straker was observing them closely from his shop. Ben is in the library researching on homicides that happened in Salem's Lot. Then Susan walked in with her mother pestering her to marry the man she found for him. Susan looked back and she saw that Ben was also in the library too, so she stylishly told him to meet her at the drive-in tonight. The children arrived at Petrie's home and it was filled with scary stuffs. Mark then suggested that they home as it's almost getting dark, and Ralph is scared of the dark. Petrie then gave him a Houdini to blow on when he's scared, so it'll help stabilize his breathing. Ben arrived at the drive-in where he was supposed to meet with Susan. Mark and Ralph were on their way home, but then Mr. Straker proceeded towards them in his car. He greeted them and further offered them a ride, but they declined his request and took a route through the forest to evade him. Susan was sitting with Mark on an anchor watching all the cars from above. He then asked her about her story, which she told him, but it was a sad one and he sympathized with her. She then asked him why he came back to Salem's Lot, and he told her that he's here just for research. Mark and Ralph were still on their way home, but then they heard a sound from the back, but they ignored it and kept on moving. All of a sudden Mr. Straker, whom they saw earlier, kidnapped Ralph and put him in the trunk of his car. Mr. Straker dragged him into the Marston house so he could sacrifice him to his master Barlow, the Lord of Flies. All the candles that were lit went off, then Master Barlow came outside to receive his sacrifice, thereby devouring Ralph in cold blood. 1 week later the search party that went looking for Ralph came back but still with nothing. Ben brought Susan home after the search and her mum was watching from upstairs. Mark was in his room blaming himself for Ralph who went missing, then he started hearing someone playing the Houdini that Petrie gave to Ralph. Mark looked through his window to see if it was Ralph, but everywhere was covered in fog, so he went outside to have a closer view. Mark tried to trace where the sound was coming from, then he saw the Houdini on the floor, but something was also creeping at his back. He turned around and walked in that direction, but then something grabbed him from above. The next day Ralph was taken to the hospital by his mum, and they diagnosed him with pernicious anemia, a condition where your body can't make blood fast enough. Mark woke up in the night and told his mum that he's thirsty, so she rushed out to call the nurse to get him some water. But when she came back he was already drinking the blood being transfused to him, and she screamed in agony. The next day the whole town gathered together for Mark's burial and Ben was also there. The undertaker fell asleep at the event, but he woke up later that night and proceeded to burying Mark's coffin. He was laying sands at the ground, then he started hearing bangings from inside the coffin. He was shocked, but the banging continued and the person inside was screaming for help. He ended up opening the coffin and saw Mark laying there motionless, so he closed it back and proceeded with the burial, not knowing Mark was already outside. He wanted to continue the burial, but he met the coffin open. Mark then came from his back and fed on him. Mr. Burke, after teaching in school, went to a bar to clear his head, then he saw the undertaker from the funeral and approached him. Burke noticed he wasn't looking so good, so he asked him what the problem was, and he told him that he hasn't been feeling well since after the funeral, and he's scared to go home. So Burke invited him to stay with him for the night. Burke saw bite marks on his neck and asked him how he got those scars, but immediately he saw the blood. It aroused something in him. Mr. Burke was taking his pipe downstairs, then he heard a knock on his front door. He went out to check who was knocking, but he saw the person climbing onto his window. Mr. Burke went immediately to meet Ben at his home. He asked Ben for a cross of any kind or a medallion of some sort, after which he insisted they follow him to his house. He then took them to the room where he kept the undertaker, and he discovered that the marks on his neck aren't there any longer. They were all sophisticated and felt he was a vampire, so they called the constable from the police department to check on him. Petrie was in his room fast asleep. Then he started hearing sounds from the window, and when he looked he saw it was Mark. Petrie put on his glasses and saw Mark pleading to let him in, so he proceeded slowly to the window, and when he made eye contact with Mark used mind compulsion to get him to open the window, as he was reluctant to open it at first. Mark flew into the window and told Petrie that Master Barlow wants to meet him, but then the cross on his desk lit up and he immediately placed it on Mark's chin, which made him flee. Petrie then rushed to close the window back and vowed to set Mark free. Petrie instantly brought out his books and started researching about vampires. He then marked out some keywords and came to a conclusion that he has to kill Barlow for Mark to be free. Burke was doing his own fair share of research on vampires so he could be prepared, but when he turned back he saw the Undertaker already transformed to a vampire, so he used the cross on his table to rebuke him. He paraded the cross around his house to make sure the vampire was gone, but he was attacked from behind and his cross was far-fetched. The vampire advanced towards him slowly, but he was able to reach for his cross, and finally rebuke him out of his house. A nurse came to tell the doctor that treated Mark that his mum was found dead this morning. She then remembered what Burke told her about vampires, so she rushed to the morgue to check if the Undertaker's body is still there, but it was gone. The doctor headed over to Burke's house and saw the whole place is messed up, and he was busted pretty bad. She told him about the death and the missing corpse from the morgue, and asked him if he had any idea what was going on. As she treated him, he told her all the deterrents for vampires, but she assumed it was all some made-up superstition. Petrie arrived with a stake in his hand to the Marston house. He first of all opened the cellar and walked right in. He looked around looking for Barlow, but Burke was in there also and asked him out. Petrie told him that Barlow is a vampire and he got Mark, but as they were discussing, Straker locked them inside. Burke lit up the candles as it was too dark inside there, then he held Petrie closely as they tried to find another way out. Burke carried Mike upstairs but it was too late. Straker opened the door and carried Petrie while Barlow fed on Burke. Night fell and Ben was with Susan and the doctor at the morgue, monitoring Mark's mother dead body closely to see if there'll be any reaction. All of a sudden her body started moving and they were all terrified. So they took chopsticks and made it into a cross so they can use it to rebuke the vampire. They started praying and the cross was glowing, but suddenly the cross broke and the vampire jumped on the doctor and eventually bit her. Susan put the cross back together and placed it on the vampire's back, which caused her to flee. After the vampire had been reprimanded, they discovered she had been bit, so they gave her a rabies shot so it could stop the bite from spreading. They then decided to go to the church authorities the next day to acquire holy items, but before that they chose to go find Burke first to tell him he was right. They drove to Burke's house, but on getting there they saw vampires on the roof of his house, so they drove away. Petrie was hung upside down at the Marston house, and as he was struggling to free himself, he fell down. Straker walked into the living room. Petrie then knocked him out from behind and killed him. Ben, Susan and the doctor went to the church to tell the priest about the vampires ravaging their town, but he didn't believe them and felt they were lying. As they were discussing, Petrie burst into the church and they were astonished on seeing him. He told them that Burke had now been transformed, after which he walked past them to get some holy water for the battle ahead. Petrie also said that Barlow is the head of the vampires, and he had to kill Straker so he could successfully escape. Petrie led the whole lot to the Marston house and they all went inside. They scanned the whole room and couldn't find Straker's body. All of a sudden a door opened right in front of them, and Ben checked it with a torchlight and discovered that there was no stairs. They eventually used a ladder to get down and was searching for the vampires. Then they started hearing a strange sound but couldn't ascertain where it was coming from. Burke then came out from the shadows and Ben staked him. Burke still caught up to Ben and was pulling him in. The priest then burst open the cellar door making Burke to be set ablaze. Then Ben staked him through his heart this time. After they got out, Petrie told them that Barlow is coming for his parents tonight, so they have to devise a means to keep everyone safe. The priest suggested they all inform each of their family members to take shelter in the church, so they can survive the night. Susan went straight home to warn her mother of the imminent danger about to befall the town, but a vampire came out of hiding and bit her. Ben then swiftly took her out of the house. The priest was at Petrie's home trying to convince his dad to follow them to the church, but he was unyielding. They then heard a creeping noise and Petrie's dad went to check it out. The priest's cross started glowing and Barlow came from behind and fed on his mom. The priest tried to rebuke Barlow with his cross but it wasn't working, and Petrie's father burst inside bleeding. Petrie ran outside and then the priest's faith started failing, which made the light on his cross to go out, and Barlow devoured him. Petrie ran into the woods and climbed onto his treehouse, but he was already surrounded by vampires. Petrie locked all the windows in the treehouse and sat there scared in his lonesome. Ben drove Susan to the church and brought her to the doctor so she can administer the rabies shot to her, but it was already too late as her transformation started. Susan burst out of the church and Ben went after her, but she was already long gone. Ben was surrounded by a league of hungry vampires, so he ran back to the church. The doctor then came out with a holy cross to wave them off, and they both got in and locked the doors. As they were inside, the vampires threw the sheriff's body inside. The next morning, Ben and the doctor went to Petrie's house, and they saw a note there that Petrie left, saying he was going to kill Barlow. Petrie infiltrated Straker's shop with a stake in his hand. Mark then tried to attack him and he used the stake on him. Ben and the doctor traced Petrie at Straker's shop and wanted to take him and run away, but he insisted that they fight back because Barlow killed his parents. The three of them went to the drive-in because they felt that that's where all the vampires took shelter. Ben then proceeded to open one of the trunks and he saw Susan laying there. Then the doctor took the stake from Petrie in a bid to kill her. Susan's mother then shot the doctor and kept on shooting, so Ben and Petrie ran for their lives. Night approached and all the vampires each opened their trunk and started coming out. They eventually surrounded Ben and almost bit him, but Petrie made a smart move by driving past the board that was blocking the sunlight, and as it fell, all the vampire in its reach burned to death. Susan's mom kept on shooting at them, then Petrie used the same vehicle to ram her to the ground and she died. They then sighted a coffin where they felt Barlow might be hiding, so Ben drew the coffin out of the truck and tried to open it, but it was too heavy. Night was slowly approaching them and they ran out of time. Barlow burst open the coffin, so they ran into the bar nearby to take shelter. Susan attacked Ben inside the bar, but he pushed Petrie outside so she couldn't reach him. Petrie got up and when he looked up he saw Barlow standing on the top of a roof, so he ran. Susan almost killed Ben, but he tumbled her and eventually staked her. Petrie was hiding in a garage. He then started turning on the lights of the cars there. Barlow started bursting in from above, and he finally caught Petrie and wanted to feed on him, but then Ben came to his rescue and staked him through his mouth and finally in his heart. Petrie crawled out of the garage and they both drove away, and that was how the movie ended. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and comment. Thank you.